She was the only woman in New York who didn't want the billionaire, and the only one he wanted, my beautiful family. This is one of the greatest love stories ever told. A timeless romance born in New York in 1970. So many of you have been asking me for a powerful love story, and here it is, from my heart to yours. But my beautiful family, please, don't leave early. Stay with me till the end. When you leave before the story finishes, it hurts me. It makes me feel like your brother, Mr. Peter, is talking alone. Hi, my beautiful family. Welcome back to Mr. Peter Stories, your own family channel. May the Almighty wrap every woman in a light so gentle, yet so powerful, that no burden can break her and no darkness can dim her. May your hearts be filled with peace that settles every storm, love that never runs dry, and dignity that stands taller than every challenge. You are the quiet strength behind every home, the soft voice that comforts, the warm hands that build futures without asking for anything in return. I pray that every tear you ever cried becomes a doorway to blessings, every sacrifice you made returns to you multiplied, and every step you take is guided with divine protection and endless grace. May your life be honored, your worth celebrated, and your soul lifted higher than you ever imagined. Let's start with love. Kirk Douglas had learned that money could buy almost anything except the one thing he'd stopped believing existed. A woman who looked at him instead of his fortune. The spring fundraiser at the Harlem Community Center smelled of lemon polish and hope, two things Kirk hadn't experienced in genuine form for longer than he cared to admit. He'd written the check that kept this place running, though nobody here knew that. Anonymous donations were the only honest thing left in his life. He stood near the refreshment table, watching volunteers set up chairs, when she walked in carrying a stack of children's books that nearly obscured her face. Doris Day moved through the room like someone who belonged to herself first and the world second. She wore a simple yellow dress that suggested spring without trying too hard, and when she smiled at the children rushing toward her, Kirk felt something shift in his chest, a recognition of authenticity he'd forgotten existed. She knelt to their level, listening to a small boy struggle through a sentence, her patience visible in the way she waited without finishing his words for him. "That's our Doris," said Eleanor, the center's director, following his gaze. "Best speech therapist in Harlem, maybe in all of New York. Children who couldn't string 3 words together are reading poetry after 6 months with her." Kirk watched Doris guide the boy through a sound, her face lit with genuine joy at his progress. "She volunteers here every Saturday, has since her husband died 4 years back, works at the public school during the week, comes here on her own time." Eleanor paused, then added with the particular sharpness of someone who'd seen too much, "Before you ask, she's not interested in men with money. Learned that lesson the hard way." Something in Eleanor's tone made Kirk curious, but before he could ask, a board member approached them. "Mr. Douglas, so generous of you to attend. Your contributions have been—" Kirk watched Doris's spine stiffen at his name. She turned, looked directly at him for the first time, and he saw something flicker across her face. Not interest, but its opposite. Recognition and dismissal in a single glance. She said something quiet to the children, stood, and walked toward the back room without another look in his direction. "Did I say something wrong?" the board member asked, confused by Kirk's distraction. Kirk excused himself and followed her path, finding Eleanor instead. "What did you mean about learning the hard way?" Eleanor studied him with the frank assessment of someone who'd survived enough disappointment to spot it coming. Doris was married to a good man named Raymond Brooks, postal worker, kind, steady, loved her like she hung the moon. 4 years ago, he was laid off when your company bought the main postal facility in Brooklyn and eliminated 200 positions to make way for luxury condos. 6 weeks after that, Raymond was hit by a drunk driver, son of the Vandenberg family. You know how that went. Lawyers made it disappear. Boy never saw the inside of a courtroom. Raymond died 3 days later. Doris was 2 months pregnant. The floor seemed to tilt beneath Kirk's feet. "The baby?" lost it from the stress. She was 28 years old, and in the space of 3 months she lost her husband, her child, and her faith that the world had any justice in it. Eleanor's voice was matter-of-fact, but her eyes held a warning. So when she hears your name, Mr. Douglas, she doesn't hear philanthropy. She hears the sound of a system that protects people like you and destroys people like Raymond. That's why she walked away just now, and that's why she'll keep walking if you're smart enough not to follow. Kirk stood in the middle of the community center, surrounded by the laughter of children and the mundane beauty of people trying to make the world slightly better, and felt the full weight of what he'd built his empire on. The luxury condos that now stood where Raymond Brooks once worked had made Kirk $7 million. He couldn't remember approving the layoffs. He'd never even seen the feasibility report, just signed off on quarterly projections and moved on to the next deal. He left the fundraiser early, his check feeling obscene in his pocket. That night, alone in his Fifth Avenue penthouse with its view of a city he owned pieces of, Kirk Douglas made a decision that would either save him or destroy him. He'd spent 43 years building walls between himself and the world his father had died trying to survive. His father, a janitor who'd worked himself to death cleaning buildings for people who never learned his name. Kirk had sworn he'd never be invisible again, never be powerless again. He'd succeeded so completely that he'd become something worse than invisible. He'd become insulated, removed from consequence, exactly like the people who'd looked through his father. Doris Day had looked at him and seen that truth immediately. The question that kept him awake until dawn was simple and terrifying. Who would he be if he gave up everything that protected him from being human? Chapter 2. The Man Who Disappeared. By Monday morning, Kirkland Douglas had begun the process of erasing himself. He started with the apartment, a modest 2-bedroom in a building 6 blocks from the community center. The lease was signed under his full legal name. No point in half measures that would unravel under scrutiny. He furnished it with pieces from estate sales and thrift stores, the kind of furniture that told stories of other people's lives, a kitchen table with cigarette burns, a sofa that sagged in the middle from years of bodies finding comfort there, bookshelves that smelled of dust and time. The clothes came next. He spent an afternoon in shops along Amsterdam Avenue, buying work shirts and trousers that looked lived in, shoes that had been resoled twice. He studied his reflection in the changing room mirror and barely recognized the man staring back. Without the armor of bespoke suits, he looked ordinary, tired, human. The job was the hardest part to make legitimate. He'd been on the board of Bethune Publishing for 6 years, anonymously funding their operations while they published books by black authors the major houses ignored. The owner, Albert Bethune, was a shrewd man in his 60s who'd built something meaningful from nothing. Kirk called him directly. I need to actually work for you, not consult, work, full-time if you'll have me. The silence on the other end stretched long. Kirk, you own half of Manhattan. What game is this? No game. I need to remember what it feels like to work for something that matters, to do work that's real. You've needed a bookkeeper since Sharon retired. I'm good with numbers, better than good. Give me the job at whatever you'd pay anyone else. And Albert, don't tell anyone who I am, please. This about a woman. Kirk looked around his new apartment, at the life he was trying to build from scratch. This is about me trying to figure out if there's anything real left under all the money. Albert agreed, though his skepticism was audible. Kirk started the following Monday, arriving at the Bethune Publishing offices in Harlem at 8 in the morning with a lunch his housekeeper had packed before she'd stared at him like he'd lost his mind. The office was cramped and chaotic, manuscripts stacked on every surface, the ancient radiator clanking its protest against the lingering spring chill. Kirk was given a desk near the window, a ledger that hadn't been properly balanced in 6 months, and curious glances from the 3 other employees. He kept his head down and worked. Actually worked. The numbers soothed him in a way that quarterly projections never had. These weren't abstractions. They were the difference between paying rent and closing doors. Every dollar mattered. By the end of the first week, he'd found $17,000 in unpaid invoices and negotiated payment plans that kept 3 authors from walking away. Albert clapped him on the shoulder and said, "Maybe you're not useless after all." Kirk had never received a compliment that meant more. The second Saturday, he returned to the community center, wore his thrift store clothes and carried a worn briefcase, found Eleanor and offered his services organizing their financial records, which were apparently kept in a series of shoeboxes that made his accountant's soul weep. Eleanor looked him up and down with that same assessing gaze. "You're really doing this?" "I'm really doing this." Why? Kirk could have lied, should have lied, but something about Eleanor's directness demanded truth. "Because I want to be someone worthy of the second look she didn't give me." Eleanor's expression softened slightly. "She's not going to make this easy for you. I know. And if you hurt her, you'll answer to me. I don't care how many buildings you own." "Fair enough." Eleanor led him to a back office that smelled of old paper and determination, showed him the shoeboxes, left him there with a warning. "Doris comes in around 10. If you're smart, you'll let her come to you." Kirk spent 2 hours organizing receipts when he heard her voice in the main room, that particular warmth she had with children. He forced himself to keep working, to not orchestrate a meeting, to let chance be actual chance. His hands shook slightly as he sorted donation records. "Who are you?" He looked up. Doris stood in the doorway, arms crossed, regarding him with polite suspicion. Up close, she was even more striking. Not beautiful in the way magazines defined beauty, but arresting. Intelligence and sorrow and strength all visible in the set of her jaw. "Kirk Douglas. Eleanor asked me to help with the books." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "That's quite a name to carry around." He'd anticipated this. "My mother loved the actor. Thought naming me after someone successful might give me a fighting chance." The lie tasted bitter, but the alternative was losing her before he'd started. "Hasn't made my life easier. People either make jokes or assume I'm lying." Something in her posture relaxed incrementally. "What do you do when you're not volunteering here?" "Bookkeeper. Small publishing house in Harlem." "Which one?" "Bethune Publishing. We focus on black authors, try to give voice to stories the bigger houses won't touch." Interest flickered across her face. "I know that house. They published a collection of children's poems I use with my students. Beautiful work." "Albert Bethune is a good man, underpaid and overworked, but good." Doris leaned against the doorframe, still maintaining distance, but no longer actively hostile. "And you volunteer here because?" Kirk chose truth wrapped in omission. "Because I spent most of my life focused on the wrong things, trying to prove something to people who died before they could see me prove it. This feels like something that matters." She studied him for a long moment. "Eleanor trusts you." "Eleanor tolerates me. I think trust is something I'll have to earn." "Smart woman." Doris pushed off from the doorframe. "I'm Doris. I work with the children on Saturdays. Speech therapy. If you're here next week and the week after that, maybe we'll talk again. People like to volunteer once. Showing up is different." She left before he could respond. Kirk sat in the small office surrounded by shoeboxes of receipts and felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the terror and exhilaration of being seen without armor. No reputation, no money, no power, just a man who'd promised to show up and the fragile possibility that showing up might be enough. He returned the next Saturday, and the one after that. Each week, Doris watched him from a distance, evaluating. He organized their finances, fixed a leaking pipe under the bathroom sink, helped set up chairs for Saturday programs, and never asked for recognition, never pushed for conversation, just showed up and worked. On the 4th Saturday, Doris brought him coffee, set it down on his desk without ceremony. "2 sugars, no milk, that's how you take it, right?" Kirk looked up, startled that she'd noticed. "That's right, thank you." "You're welcome." She turned to leave, then paused. "You're good at this. The books, I mean." We can actually see where the money goes now. Eleanor says you found donors we'd forgotten about, just following the paper trail. Well, keep following it. She almost smiled. Same time next week? I'll be here. After she left, Kirk sat alone in the office and understood he was falling in love with a woman who didn't know his name, not his real name. And every day that he didn't tell her the truth, he was building something beautiful on a foundation of lies. Chapter 3. Building something real. Summer settled over Harlem like a thick blanket, and Kirk Douglas learned what it meant to live instead of perform. The transformation happened in increments too small to name individually but profound in their accumulation. He walked to work instead of being driven, bought groceries from corner markets where the owners learned his name, sat on his fire escape in the evenings listening to music drift from open windows and conversations flow between buildings. The city he'd viewed from his penthouse as an abstraction of property values became textured, specific, human. His hands developed calluses from fixing things at the community center. His face tanned from walking Harlem's streets. His body remembered how to be tired in the way that came from useful work instead of stress. Doris remained cautious, but caution was different from hostility. They developed a routine. Kirk arrived at the community center early, organized files and balanced books until she came in at 10. She'd bring him coffee, always 2 sugars, no milk, and they'd exchange perhaps 3 sentences before she moved to work with the children. But those 3 sentences lengthened into 5, then 10, then actual conversations that happened naturally instead of being forced. One Saturday in late June, a thunderstorm trapped them in the center after the children had left. Rain hammered the windows. Thunder shook the old building's bones. They sat in the main room, Doris sorting through educational materials while Kirk finished receipts from the spring fundraiser. "Can I ask you something?" Doris said, not looking up from her sorting. "Of course." "Why bookkeeping? You're clearly smart enough to do anything. Why spend your life tracking other people's money?" Kirk set down his pen, considering his answer carefully. "My father died when I was 17. Heart attack brought on by exhaustion. He worked 3 jobs trying to keep our family fed, and the thing that killed him was the stress of never being able to stop working. After he died, I promised myself I'd understand money well enough that I'd never be that afraid again. So I learned accounting, learned how money moved and where it hid. Bookkeeping is honest work. Numbers don't lie. They just are." It wasn't the whole truth, but it wasn't entirely a lie either. His father had died that way. Kirk had made that promise. He'd just taken it to an extreme Doris couldn't imagine. She looked at him then, really looked, and he saw recognition in her eyes. "My husband used to say something similar, that honest work was its own dignity, that you could be poor and still have your soul intact." Her voice caught slightly on the word husband. "He believed that until the day he died." "How long has it been?" 4 years this August. Sometimes it feels like yesterday, sometimes it feels like a lifetime ago. Kirk wanted to ask more, but something in her face warned against pushing. Instead, he said, "He was lucky to have you." "I was lucky to have him." Doris returned to her sorting, but after a moment added, "You remind me of him sometimes. The way you listen more than you talk. The way you fix things without making it seem like fixing things makes you superior to the people who needed things fixed. Raymond was like that, present without needing to be the center of attention." The compliment sat in Kirk's chest like a stone and a blessing. He was being compared to a good man, a man Doris had loved, and the comparison was based entirely on deception. "That means more than you know." The rain continued. They worked in comfortable silence, broken only by thunder and the scratch of his pen against paper. When the storm passed, Doris stood to leave. At the door, she turned back. "Same time next week? I'll be here." "I know you will. That's the remarkable thing. You actually show up." After she left, Kirk sat in the empty community center and understood he was trapped. He'd built something real with Doris, a friendship based on shared values and genuine connection. But the foundation was rotten with omission. Every day that passed made the truth more catastrophic, and every day that passed made walking away more impossible. The summer deepened. Kirk's double life became almost comfortable, the edges between his two identities blurring. At Bethune Publishing, he was simply Kirk, the bookkeeper who'd stabilized their finances and earned Albert's gruff respect. At the community center, he was Kirk the volunteer who never missed a Saturday and had become part of the furniture. In his modest apartment, he was a man learning to cook for himself, to live with silence, to find peace in ordinariness. With Doris, he was becoming someone he'd never been, honest in all the ways that mattered except the one that would destroy them. They started taking walks after the center closed. Doris would mention needing to pick something up from the market, and Kirk would offer to walk with her. These walks stretched longer each week, routes that wound through Harlem's tree-lined streets, while they talked about everything and nothing. She told him about her work with children, the particular joy of watching a child who'd been silent find their voice. He told her about his work at Bethune, the satisfaction of helping bring books into the world that might change someone's life. "Do you ever want more?" Doris asked one August evening as they walked through Marcus Garvey Park. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed too beautiful for the broken world they lived in. "More of what?" "More than bookkeeping and volunteering. A bigger life, more success, more recognition, more... I don't know. More." Kirk thought about his penthouse sitting empty across town, his business empire running on autopilot while he played at being ordinary, the wealth that insulated him from consequence. "I used to think I did. Spent years chasing success, thinking it would fill something inside me. But the more I accumulated, the emptier I felt. This..." He gestured around them at the park, the neighborhood, the ordinary beauty of an August evening. "This feels like enough, maybe more than enough." Doris stopped walking, looked at him with an intensity that made his breath catch. "You say that now, but people change. People want things they swore they didn't want. People leave." "Your husband didn't leave. He was taken from you. That's different." "I know that. Intellectually, I know that." She resumed walking, arms wrapped around herself despite the warmth. "But sometimes loss feels the same no matter how it happens. You build a life with someone, make plans, imagine a future. Then one day you're alone, and those plans are ash, and you have to figure out who you are when you're not half of something anymore." Kirk wanted to reach for her hand but didn't. "You're not half of something. You're whole, the most whole person I've ever met." She laughed, but it held no humor. "Is that what you see? Because some days I feel like I'm held together with spit and prayers." "Then you're doing a remarkable job of it." They walked in silence for several minutes. Finally, Doris said quietly, "I haven't let myself care about someone in 4 years. It's safer that way, easier, but you make it hard to stay safe." Kirk's heart hammered against his ribs. "Is that a bad thing?" "I don't know yet. Ask me in 6 months." It was the closest thing to hope he'd been offered, and it terrified him more than any business deal ever had. Because in 6 months, she'd either know the truth and hate him, or he'd still be lying, and the foundation would be even more unstable. There was no path forward that didn't involve pain. The only question was whose pain and how much. That night, alone in his apartment, Kirk Douglas made a decision. He would tell her the truth. Not yet, not before she trusted him enough to survive the shock, but soon, before the end of the year, before they built anything more on these fragile foundations. He wrote the promise to himself in a journal he'd started keeping, concrete evidence of his intent to be honest. The promise felt hollow, even as he wrote it. Chapter 4. The question of forever autumn arrived with the particular clarity that comes before winter, and Kirk Douglas understood he was going to marry Doris Day if she'd have him. And that understanding made the weight of his deception unbearable. They'd moved beyond walks and Saturday volunteering into something that looked remarkably like a relationship. Dinner at small restaurants where the owners knew Doris by name. Evening jazz shows in basement clubs where the music was better than anything money could buy. Sunday dinners at her mother's apartment where Kirk was subjected to the loving interrogation of women who'd survived too much to trust easily. Doris's mother, Loretta, was 63 years old and sharp as broken glass. She'd raised Doris alone after her father left when Doris was 7, left for a white woman with family connections, and hadn't looked back. Loretta worked as a seamstress, her fingers permanently curved from decades of needlework, her eyes missing nothing. "So you're a bookkeeper," Loretta said the first time Kirk joined them for Sunday dinner. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am." "Make good money?" "Enough." "Enough for what?" Kirk met her gaze steadily. "Enough to pay my rent, buy groceries, help where I can. I'm not wealthy, Mrs. Day, but I'm not hungry either." "And you work at this publishing house in Harlem?" "Bethune Publishing, yes. Albert Bethune. I know his wife, Claudette. Good people. Claudette mentioned they hired a new bookkeeper who actually knows what he's doing. That you?" "I hope so." Loretta studied him the way a jeweler studies a stone looking for flaws. "Where are your people?" Kirk had prepared for this question, but found the prepared answer inadequate under her scrutiny. "Gone. My father died when I was 17. Heart attack. My mother passed 3 years later. Cancer. I have a brother in California I haven't spoken to in 5 years. We had a falling out over my father's estate. Couldn't agree on what to do with the little he left." All technically true, though the little he left had been $140,000. A fortune to some, an insult to Kirk's brother, who'd wanted Kirk to leverage it into investment capital. Kirk had used it to pay off his father's debts and donate the rest to a scholarship fund. His brother had called him a sentimental fool. They hadn't spoken since. Something in Loretta's expression softened microscopically. "So you're alone in the world?" "Yes, ma'am." "And you're courting my daughter?" Doris made a sound of protest. "Mama, we're just..." "Child, I've been watching men court women for 63 years. I know what this is." Loretta turned back to Kirk. "My daughter has been hurt enough. Her father left us for greener pastures. Her husband was taken from her by people who think money makes them immune to consequence. She lost a baby in the grief of that loss. You understand what I'm telling you?" Kirk's throat felt tight. "I understand." "Do you? Because from where I sit, you're a man who appeared in her life with a convenient job and a convenient backstory and convenient timing. Maybe you're exactly who you say you are. Maybe you're not. But if you're lying about anything, anything at all, you walk away now, before she invests more of herself in this." The dinner table went silent. Doris stared at her mother in horror. Kirk felt the moment crystallize into sharp relief. He could tell the truth right now, in this kitchen that smelled of greens and cornbread, and face the consequences. Or he could lie again and dig the hole deeper. He chose the coward's path. "I'm not lying about who I am." Loretta held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "We'll see. Pass the chicken, Doris." The dinner continued, but Kirk barely tasted the food. On the walk back to her apartment, Doris was quiet. Finally, she said, "I'm sorry about my mother. She's protective. She loves you. That's not something to apologize for. She made it sound like I'm some fragile thing that needs protecting." Kirk stopped walking, took her hands in his. "You're not fragile. You're strong enough to survive things that would break most people. But that doesn't mean you have to survive more than you should have to. Your mother sees that. So do I." Doris looked up at him, her eyes reflecting streetlights and something that might have been the beginning of love. "Are you lying to me about anything?" The question hit like a physical blow. Kirk wanted to tell her everything, wanted it so badly his chest ached with the wanting. But fear was stronger than honesty. "No, I'm not lying to you." She searched his face, looking for the truth his words denied. Whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy her, because she nodded and squeezed his hands. "Good. Because I don't think I could survive being lied to again. Not about anything important. They walked the rest of the way in silence, and Kirk understood he'd just made the worst mistake of his life. Not because he'd lied, he'd been lying all along, but because he'd looked into the eyes of the woman he loved, been given a direct opportunity to tell the truth, and chosen deception. There was no rationalization that made that choice acceptable. That night, Kirk sat in his apartment staring at the journal where he'd promised to tell her the truth before the year ended. It was early October. He had less than 3 months. The thought of telling her was torture. The thought of continuing the lie was worse. He was trapped between 2 equally unbearable futures, and the weight of that trap was crushing him. At Bethune Publishing, Albert noticed the change. "You look like a man with a terminal diagnosis. You sick?" "No." "Woman trouble?" Kirk didn't answer, which was answer enough. Albert sat down heavily in the chair across from Kirk's desk. "Let me tell you something about women. They can forgive most things if the apology is genuine and the change is real. But they can't forgive being treated like they're too stupid to handle the truth. You holding something back from this woman?" "Yes." "Something big?" "Yes." "And you keep telling yourself you'll tell her later when the time is right?" Kirk nodded. Albert sighed. "Son, the time is never right for hard truths. You tell her now and deal with the consequences, or you keep lying and lose her eventually anyway. But you lose her worse that way. You lose her with contempt attached. What if telling her means losing her immediately? Then you lose her immediately. But at least she gets to decide what she's willing to live with instead of you deciding for her." Albert stood, joints creaking. "I'm old enough to know there's no perfect choice, but there's usually a more honest one. You seem like a man who cares about honesty. Prove it." Kirk promised himself he'd tell Doris everything at Thanksgiving. Give them 1 more month of this fragile peace, then lay everything bare and accept whatever came. It was the coward's compromise, but it was something, a deadline, a commitment. November arrived cold and clear. Kirk bought a ring, simple, understated, within the means of the bookkeeper he was pretending to be. He carried it in his pocket like a talisman and a threat. After he told her the truth, if she somehow still wanted him, he'd ask her to marry him. If she didn't, he'd have the ring as a reminder of what dishonesty cost. The last Saturday before Thanksgiving, they worked late at the community center. Eleanor had gone home. The children had left hours ago. Kirk and Doris sat in the main room, she grading papers and he organizing donation records, comfortable in the companionable silence they'd developed. "I need to tell you something," Kirk said suddenly, the words escaping before courage could fail him. Doris looked up from her papers. "That sounds ominous." "It might be. I've been—" The door burst open. A woman Kirk vaguely recognized from the neighborhood stood there, breathless and panicked. "Doris, thank God, it's Mrs. Henderson. She fell. Ambulance is coming, but she's asking for you." Doris was up and moving before Kirk could process what was happening. She grabbed her coat, called over her shoulder, "Lock up when you leave," and was gone. Kirk sat alone in the community center. The moment of confession evaporated, and wondered if the universe was trying to tell him something. He locked up, walked home through November cold, sat in his apartment and stared at the ring he'd bought and the truth he couldn't speak. 2 weeks later, his world ended. Chapter 5. The Day the Truth Burned. Everything down the library fundraiser at the Whitmore Mansion on Fifth Avenue was the kind of event Doris Day would normally never attend, but her colleague Sarah had begged for company and Doris owed her favors. The mansion dripped with old money and older arrogance, the kind of place where Doris felt both invisible and hypervisible, ignored by the wealthy attendees while being watched by staff who looked like her. She stood near the refreshment table, counting the minutes until she could politely leave, when Sarah grabbed her arm. "Oh my God, Doris, that's him. That's who?" Sarah pointed to a portrait on the wall, oil painting in an ornate frame positioned in the entrance hall where everyone entering had to see it. A younger man in a business suit, photographed against the Manhattan skyline. Strong jaw, confident eyes, the particular polish that came from generational wealth. The brass plaque below read, Kirkland Douglas, Principal Benefactor. The room tilted. Doris felt her stomach drop through the floor. "That's the developer," Sarah was saying, her voice coming from very far away. "The one who bought the postal facility and put up those luxury condos. Remember? Where Raymond worked before." She trailed off, finally noticing Doris's expression. "Doris, are you okay?" Doris couldn't breathe. Her vision tunneled. That face, she knew that face. The same strong jaw, the same eyes that crinkled when he laughed. Older now, but unmistakably the same man who'd been having coffee with her every Saturday for 6 months. The man who'd held her hands 2 weeks ago and looked her directly in the eyes and told her he wasn't lying about anything. "I need to leave." "What's wrong? Do you know him?" Doris was already moving toward the exit, her body operating on autopilot, while her mind tried to process the enormity of what she'd just discovered. Kirk. Her Kirk. The bookkeeper who wore thrift store clothes and fixed leaking pipes. The man who'd made her believe in trusting someone again. That man was Kirkland Douglas. The Kirkland Douglas. The real estate magnate whose company had destroyed Raymond's life. She made it to the street before she vomited into a garbage can. Sarah hovered nearby, confused and concerned, but Doris couldn't explain, couldn't form words, could only see that portrait and the brass plaque and understand that everything, every conversation, every coffee, every moment of growing trust had been a lie. The modest apartment was a stage set. The thrift store clothes were a costume. The bookkeeping job was a hobby for a man who controlled millions. He'd played her, performed poverty and humility like a role in some experiment, and she'd been the unknowing subject. The woman too traumatized to see manipulation when it was wrapped in kind words and patient listening. She thought of her father, who'd pretended to love her mother until a wealthier option came along. She thought of the Vandenberg boy who'd killed Raymond and walked free because money bought immunity from consequence. She thought of every time Kirk had looked at her with those warm eyes and lied through his teeth about who he was. The rage that filled her was clean and absolute. Sarah helped her into a cab, gave the driver Doris's address, pressed money into the driver's hand and made him promise to see her safely inside. Doris sat in the back seat, shaking with fury and grief and the particular devastation that comes from realizing you've been a fool. At home, she sat in her small living room until the shaking stopped and something harder took its place. Kirk called that evening. She didn't answer. He called again an hour later. She unplugged the phone. At 10 o'clock, there was knocking at her door. Urgent, desperate, his voice calling her name. Doris walked to the door, put her hand against the wood, could feel him on the other side, could sense his panic and his guilt and his desperate need to explain. She imagined opening the door, imagined him trying to justify what he'd done, imagined herself believing him because she wanted so badly for there to be an explanation that made this okay. She opened the door just wide enough for him to see her face. "I know who you are." Kirk's face went white. "Doris, please let me. I know what you are. I know about the postal facility. I know about the luxury condos. I know that my husband lost his job because of you, and I know that you spent 6 months lying to me about literally everything." Her voice was preternaturally calm, the kind of calm that came before hurricanes. "I need you to understand something. This isn't anger that you can apologize away. This isn't hurt that time will heal. This is over. Completely. I never want to see you again. I never want to hear your voice again. I never want to think about you again. Do you understand? Doris, do you understand?" Kirk's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Yes. Good." She started to close the door, then paused. "The worst part? I actually believed you. I thought you were different. I thought you saw me as a person instead of a project or a prize or some kind of challenge. But you're exactly like every other man with money. You think the world is your playground and the rest of us are toys. I hope that knowledge keeps you warm in whatever mansion you actually live in." She closed the door, locked it, walked to her bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, listening to him call her name through the door until her neighbors threatened to call the police. Listened to his footsteps finally retreat down the hallway, listened to the silence that followed and understood that the silence would be permanent. On her nightstand sat a photo of Raymond, smiling at the camera on their wedding day. Doris picked it up, traced his face with her finger and whispered, "I'm so sorry I let someone make me forget what real love looks like." The next morning she found letters slipped under her door, 5 of them, his handwriting desperate and cramped. She put them in a shoebox without reading them and shoved the shoebox in the back of her closet. Over the following days, more letters arrived. She returned them unopened, writing "refused" across the envelopes in red ink. He called Bethune Publishing. Albert told him gently but firmly not to call again. He appeared at the community center. Eleanor barred the door and told him that if he truly cared about Doris, he'd respect her wishes and leave her alone. He stopped coming. The silence that settled over Doris's life was absolute and suffocating. She went to work, taught her students, smiled when appropriate, and felt nothing. At night she lay awake and replayed every conversation, every moment, looking for the truth beneath the performance. Had any of it been real? When he'd talked about his father, had that been true? When he'd fixed the leaking pipe or balanced the books or listened to her talk about Raymond, had any part of that been genuine? The not knowing was worse than the betrayal. November became December. Doris moved through her life like a ghost, functioning but not living. Her mother asked what happened to that nice man who'd been coming to dinners. Doris said it didn't work out and changed the subject. Sarah asked if she was okay. Doris said she was fine and stopped accepting social invitations. At the community center, someone new showed up to organize the finances. A woman named Beverly, who was competent but lacked Kirk's intuitive understanding of how to make limited resources stretch. Doris volunteered for extra shifts, throwing herself into work because work didn't require feeling and feeling had become too dangerous. One evening, Eleanor found her crying in the storage room where Kirk used to work. Sat down beside her without asking permission, held her while she sobbed, and didn't offer any false comfort about time healing wounds or men not deserving tears, just sat there in solidarity, another woman who'd survived the particular devastation of discovering someone she'd trusted was a fiction. "The hardest part," Doris said when she could speak again, "is that I still love him, the him I knew. Even knowing it was all fake, I still love the person he pretended to be." How pathetic is that? That's not pathetic. That's human. We love who people show us they are. It's not your fault he showed you someone who didn't exist. I should have known. My mother saw it. She knew something was wrong. And you wanted to believe people could be good without ulterior motives. That's not a character flaw. That's hope. Don't let him take that from you. But Doris felt her hope bleeding out, replaced by the cold certainty that trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. She'd trusted her father, who left. She'd trusted Raymond, who died. She'd trusted Kirk, who was never real. The pattern was clear. Everyone she loved found a way to leave her, and she was tired of being the one left behind. Winter deepened. Christmas came and went. Doris celebrated with her mother and pretended she wasn't haunted by memories of a man who'd never existed. The new year arrived without fanfare or hope, and through it all, the shoebox of unopened letters sat in the back of her closet, a monument to everything she'd almost believed and everything that had turned to ash. Chapter 6. The silence that followed. Kirk. Douglas discovered that the opposite of love wasn't hate, it was emptiness. He returned to his penthouse on Fifth Avenue, that massive apartment he hadn't seen in 7 months, and found it exactly as he'd left it. Immaculate, sterile, cold. The cleaning service had maintained everything in perfect order, dusting furniture nobody used and polishing floors nobody walked on. He stood in the living room with its floor-to-ceiling windows and $3 million view and felt the walls closing in. His business partner, Gerald, had been managing operations during Kirk's absence. The quarterly report sat on his desk, showing profits that meant nothing. Gerald came by the second day Kirk was back, took one look at him, and poured them both scotch at 11 in the morning. Want to talk about it? No. Going to talk about it anyway. Kirk drained the scotch. I fell in love with someone. I lied to her about who I was. She found out. That's the whole story. That's not the whole story. That's the outline of a story. What did you lie about? Everything. I pretended to be a bookkeeper, lived in a different apartment, wore different clothes, made her believe I was someone I'm not. Gerald refilled Kirk's glass. Why? Because every woman who knew I was Kirkland Douglas saw dollar signs. She was the first person in 20 years who looked at me like I was just a man. I wanted to keep that. I wanted someone to love me for who I am instead of what I have. So you made it impossible for her to love you for who you are by lying about who you are. You see the problem there? Kirk laughed, but it held no humor. I see the problem very clearly now. Can you fix it? No, she won't talk to me, won't read my letters. I went to see her and she made it very clear that showing up again would be harassment. She's done, completely. Gerald studied him with the particular insight of someone who'd known him for 15 years. You love her. It doesn't matter. Of course it matters. Love is the only thing that matters. Not when it's built on lies. Kirk set down the glass, suddenly exhausted. I need to get back to work. What's urgent? They spent 3 hours reviewing contracts and projects, but Kirk couldn't focus. His mind kept wandering to a woman in Harlem who wouldn't answer his calls, to Saturday mornings at a community center that would never welcome him again, to a life he'd built and destroyed in equal measure. Over the following weeks, Kirk learned what it meant to be functionally successful and emotionally dead. He attended meetings, signed documents, made decisions that affected thousands of employees and millions in assets. Everyone told him it was good to have him back. Nobody asked why he looked like he was attending his own funeral. He stopped eating. Food tasted like ash. He stopped sleeping. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Doris's face when she told him she never wanted to see him again. He started drinking, not enough to be drunk, just enough to dull the edges of consciousness. Gerald intervened after 2 weeks. You're killing yourself. I'm working. You're not working. You're going through motions. There's a difference. Gerald pulled a file from his briefcase. This came across my desk this morning. The city wants to reallocate funds from community programs to infrastructure. One of the programs being cut is that community center in Harlem, the one where you were volunteering. Kirk's attention snapped into focus. What? They're redirecting the funding to a development project. 3 blocks of low-income housing being demolished to make way for mixed-use commercial and residential. We're the primary contractor. It's an $18 million project. The room tilted. Kirk's company was going to profit from destroying the place where he'd found meaning. The place where Doris worked. The bitter irony was suffocating. Who approved this? You did, 6 months ago, before you disappeared into your alternate identity. Kirk looked at the file. His signature was there, authorizing the feasibility study that had led to this moment. He'd signed off on destroying the community center without even realizing it existed, had been so disconnected from the actual impact of his business that he'd greenlit the demolition of the very place that had changed his life. Pull us out of the project. Gerald's eyebrows rose. Kirk, this is $18 million. I don't care. Pull us out. Find a way to kill the project entirely if possible. We're contractually obligated. Pulling out would cost us millions in penalties and destroy our relationship with the city. Kirk stood up, paced to the window, stared down at the city that looked so clean and orderly from up here. Then pay the penalties. Burn the relationships. I don't care. We're not doing this project. This is about her. This is about me finally understanding that money isn't a shield from consequences. It's a guarantee of them. Kirk turned back to Gerald. My company destroyed her husband's livelihood. My company is now going to destroy the place where she works. No, not happening. Find a way out or I'll dissolve the company entirely. Gerald stared at him like he'd announced his intention to fly to the moon. You're serious? Completely. The board will fight you. Let them. I own controlling interest. They can fight all they want. Gerald gathered his papers slowly, deliberately. I've known you for 15 years. I've never seen you like this. Like what? Like someone who finally understands that power without principle is just organized brutality. Gerald paused at the door. For what it's worth, I think you're doing the right thing, even if it bankrupts us. After Gerald left, Kirk sat at his desk and began making the calls that would dismantle what he'd spent 20 years building. He contacted city officials, offered to pay cancellation penalties out of his personal funds, reached out to community advocacy groups and offered to support their legal challenges to the project, used every connection and every dollar to ensure the community center would survive. It cost him $17 million in penalties and destroyed his relationship with 3 major city contractors. His board called an emergency meeting and demanded his resignation. Kirk refused. They threatened a vote of no confidence. Kirk told them to vote however they wanted, but they'd have to buy him out if they wanted to proceed with the project, and the buyout would bankrupt the company. The board backed down, but barely. Kirk's reputation in business circles took a savage hit. He was called unstable, emotional, a man who'd lost his edge. His wealth took a significant blow, not enough to make him poor by any stretch, but enough to sting, enough to be real. He didn't tell Doris, didn't use it as leverage for forgiveness. He simply did it because it was the first genuinely honest thing he'd done in months, choosing people over profit, even when those people would never know and would never forgive him. The holidays passed. Winter dragged on. Kirk moved through his diminished empire like a ghost, making changes that felt too small and too late. He redirected funds to community programs, established oversight committees to evaluate the human cost of development projects, created anonymous scholarship funds for families displaced by his previous projects. None of it brought her back. None of it made him less alone. One evening in late February, Albert called. Kirk, it's Albert. How did you get this number? You're not as anonymous as you think you are. I've known who you were since the second week you worked for me. I have friends in places you'd be surprised about. Kirk sat down heavily. You knew? Of course I knew. I also knew you were trying to be someone better than the person you'd been. I respected that. Still do. Doris won't talk to me, won't see me. I don't blame her. I'm not calling about Doris, I'm calling about you. Word on the street is you blew up your company to save the community center. That true? More or less. Why? Kirk was silent for a long moment. Because it was the right thing to do. Because I'm tired of being the kind of person who does the profitable thing instead of the right thing. Because maybe if I become the person I pretended to be, I can live with myself again. That's good enough for me. We need a full-time bookkeeper at the publishing house. Real job, real work, modest pay. You want it? You're offering me my fake job for real. I'm offering you a chance to mean what you said about honest work mattering. You interested? Kirk thought about his penthouse and his board meetings and his empire that felt like a tomb. When do I start? Monday. After the call ended, Kirk sat in his expensive apartment surrounded by expensive things and understood that he was being given an unexpected gift, the chance to actually become the person he'd been pretending to be. Not for Doris, because Doris was gone and never coming back, but for himself, to prove that the man he'd been for those 7 months wasn't entirely fiction. He looked around the penthouse one last time, then called his real estate agent. I'm putting this place on the market. I need you to find me a modest apartment in Harlem, 2-bedroom, nothing fancy. Can you do that? Mr. Douglas, are you sure? This property is worth, I'm sure. Make it happen. That night, Kirk packed the few personal items that actually mattered. His father's watch, his mother's recipes, the ring he'd bought for a woman who'd never wear it. Left the rest for the estate sale, moved into his old apartment in Harlem, the one that had been a stage set but was now becoming real. He started at Bethune Publishing on Monday, arrived at 8, did the work, went home at 5. The routine was comforting in its simplicity. Albert treated him exactly like any other employee, no special consideration, no acknowledgement of who he used to be, just work that needed doing and the expectation that Kirk would do it well. The community centre didn't welcome him back, but he didn't expect them to. He'd destroyed their trust. The best he could do was ensure they survived. Weeks became months. Kirk learned to live with loneliness as a permanent condition. Learned to find small satisfactions in work well done and changes honestly made. Learned that becoming a better person didn't make you happy, just less ashamed. And every night he thought about a woman who'd taught him the difference between having everything and having something real, and wished he'd been brave enough to be honest when honesty might have saved them both. Chapter 7. The distance between worlds spring arrived reluctantly, and Doris Day learned that survival was not the same as healing. She went through the motions of her life with mechanical precision, woke at 6, showered, coffee with cinnamon, though the taste now reminded her of betrayal. Took the bus to the school where she taught speech therapy to children who struggled to form words. Volunteered at the community centre on Saturdays, though she no longer lingered after her shifts ended. Returned home, made dinner she barely ate, went to bed, repeated. Her mother watched with increasing concern. "Baby, you're fading." "I'm fine." "You're not fine. You haven't been fine since December." Doris set down her coffee cup. They were having Sunday dinner, just the two of them at Loretta's small kitchen table. "What do you want me to say, that I'm heartbroken? That I trusted someone who turned out to be a lie? I've said it. Now I'm dealing with it." "Dealing with it how? By pretending you don't feel anything?" "By protecting myself from feeling too much." Loretta reached across the table, took Doris's hand. "That's not protection, baby. That's just a different kind of dying." Doris pulled her hand away. "I'd rather die slowly than all at once again. I'm done with all at once." She meant it. The grief of losing Kirk, or the person she'd thought was Kirk, had been just as devastating as losing Raymond. Maybe worse, because this loss came with the added humiliation of having been fooled. She'd rebuilt herself once. She didn't have the energy to do it again. At the community centre, Eleanor watched her with worried eyes, but didn't push. Just made sure Doris had coffee and support, and space to be whatever she needed to be. The new bookkeeper, Beverly, was perfectly competent, but sometimes Doris would pass the storage room where Kirk used to work and feel a physical ache in her chest. In early March, the community centre received news that the city funding was being restored, more than restored, increased. The development project that would have demolished 3 surrounding blocks had been cancelled. Eleanor called an emergency meeting to celebrate, confused but grateful. "I don't understand," Eleanor said, reading the letter from the city council. "This project was a done deal, 20 million in contracts, major developer already signed on. Now it's just cancelled?" "Maybe someone came to their senses," Beverly suggested. "The city doesn't come to its senses. The city follows money. Someone made this more expensive to proceed than to cancel." Doris listened with half attention, grateful the centre was saved but unable to muster much enthusiasm for anything. She filed the news away as good but irrelevant to her personal situation and went back to work with the children. 2 weeks later, Sarah stopped by Doris's apartment unexpectedly. She looked uncomfortable, clutching a folder to her chest like armor. "I need to show you something." "What?" "I've been doing research on Kirk, on Kirkland Douglas, because what he did to you made me angry, and I wanted to understand what kind of person does that to someone." Doris felt her stomach clench. "I don't want to talk about him." "I know, but I think you need to see this." Sarah opened the folder, spread papers across Doris's coffee table. News articles, public records, business filings. "Look at the dates." Doris looked. December, January, February. Headlines about Douglas development withdrawing from major projects. About $17 million in cancellation penalties paid personally by Kirkland Douglas, about board disputes and reputation damage, and a significant reduction in his personal wealth. I don't understand what I'm looking at. The development project that was going to demolish the community center? That was his company. He killed his own project, paid massive penalties out of his own pocket, and basically destroyed his reputation in the process. Doris sat down slowly. Why would he do that? I don't know. But it gets more interesting. Sarah pulled out another set of documents. Over the past 4 months, his company has redirected funding to community programs across Harlem, established scholarship funds, created oversight committees to evaluate the human impact of development projects. It's like he's systematically trying to undo 20 years of business practices. That doesn't change what he did to me. I'm not saying it does. I'm saying it's weird. Men like that don't usually have sudden moral awakenings. Sarah gathered her papers. I talked to my friend who works in the city clerk's office. She said Douglas showed up personally to pay the cancellation fees. She said he looked terrible, like he hadn't slept in weeks, like he was running on spite and coffee. After Sarah left, Doris sat with the information, trying to process what it meant. Kirk had destroyed his own project to save the community center, had taken a financial hit that probably cost him millions, had done it without telling her, without using it as leverage, without asking for anything in return. She didn't know what to do with that information. The shoebox of unopened letters sat in her closet, a weight she couldn't bring herself to confront. Sometimes she thought about reading them, wondered what excuses or explanations they contained. But opening those letters would mean engaging with him again, and she wasn't sure she could survive that. April arrived with unexpected warmth. Doris walked through Marcus Garvey Park on a Sunday afternoon, watching families and couples enjoy the spring weather, and felt desperately alone. She'd built walls around herself so high that nobody could hurt her, but those same walls kept out everything else too: joy, connection, hope, possibility. She thought about what her mother had said about dying slowly, thought about Raymond, who'd lived so fully right up until the moment he couldn't anymore, wondered what he would say about her current state. Probably something gentle and challenging, probably something about not letting fear make her smaller. On impulse, Doris stopped at the library, asked to see the business section, found articles about Kirkland Douglas spanning 20 years. She read them methodically, building a picture of the man behind the lie. She learned he'd grown up poor, his father dying young from overwork. She learned he'd built his fortune with ruthless efficiency, never backing down from a deal, never showing weakness. She learned his reputation was for being brilliant but cold, strategic but unfeeling. She learned he'd never married, never had serious relationships that made the society pages seem to live for work alone. Then she found articles from December through March. The sudden policy changes, the cancelled projects, the financial hits. One editorial called him unstable. Another called him a man who'd lost his edge. A business columnist speculated about a breakdown or health crisis. None of the articles mentioned a woman in Harlem who taught him to care about something more than profit margins. Doris left the library with more questions than answers. If Kirk's transformation was real, if he'd actually changed, did that make his original deception more forgivable or less? If he'd become the person he'd pretended to be, did that mean the person she'd loved had been real after all, just buried under years of armor? She didn't know, couldn't know. The only way to find answers would be to talk to him, and talking to him meant risking everything she'd built to protect herself. That night, Doris pulled the shoebox from her closet, sat on her bed with it in her lap, stared at the pile of unopened letters, all returned to sender, all marked refused in her handwriting. She could burn them, could throw them away unread, could keep them in their box and never confront what they contained. Or she could open one, just one. See if there was anything worth salvaging in the wreckage he'd made. Her hands shook as she picked up the first letter. The envelope was worn, like it had been handled many times. Her name was written in his neat, precise handwriting. She turned it over again. trying to decide if knowing was better than not knowing. Finally, she set it aside, unopened. Not yet. She wasn't ready yet. Maybe she never would be. But she didn't put the shoebox back in the closet. She left it on her nightstand, a question she wasn't ready to answer, but also wasn't ready to throw away. Outside her window, spring night settled over Harlem, and somewhere in the same neighborhood, a man who'd destroyed himself trying to become worthy of her sat in his own apartment, probably wondering if she'd ever forgive him. Doris didn't know if forgiveness was possible, didn't know if she wanted it to be, but for the first time in 4 months, she wasn't sure she wanted to spend the rest of her life not knowing. Chapter 8. The letter she wasn't supposed to find. The discovery happened on a Thursday afternoon in late April when Doris wasn't looking for anything except a reason to leave work early. The school's administrative office was chaos, filing cabinets open, papers everywhere, Mrs. Patterson retiring after 30 years and nobody knowing where anything was. Doris had been drafted to help organize records, a task that seemed impossible given the state of things. She was filing budget documents when she noticed the letterhead, City Council, Office of Community Development. The letter was dated February. It outlined the cancellation of the housing development project, the restoration of community center funding, and a significant increase in allocations for youth programs across Harlem. Nothing unusual except the handwritten note at the bottom, barely legible, clearly not meant for wide distribution. Per Douglas, community preservation priority, cancel all contracts, full penalty payment authorized from personal assets. Additional funding secured through private sector partnerships, Douglas Development Foundation primary contributor. Doris read it 3 times, looked at the date. February, 4 months ago. 2 months after she'd told Kirk to never contact her again. The foundation name sounded familiar. She'd heard it somewhere recently but couldn't place where. Mrs. Patterson? What's the Douglas Development Foundation? Mrs. Patterson looked up from her box of files. That's Kirkland Douglas's charitable organization. Funny you should mention it. They've been supporting our speech therapy program for years, but recently they've increased funding significantly. We received a grant in January that tripled our budget. Let me find the paperwork. She rummaged through a different box, emerged with a folder. Here, Douglas Development Foundation. Been supporting education programs in Harlem since the late 60s. Always anonymous, never any publicity. We only know because the accountant tracks funding sources. Why? Doris took the folder, hands unsteady. Inside were grant letters going back years, supporting the community center, supporting her school's speech therapy program, supporting the publishing house where Kirk had worked, all anonymous, all long before she'd met him. Has anyone from the foundation ever visited? Anyone from the Douglas Company? Not that I know of. Everything's handled through lawyers and accountants, very hands-off. Mrs. Patterson paused. Although there was that bookkeeper who helped us with the budget last year. Nice man, quiet, worked for free. What was his name? Kirk something? The folder slipped from Doris's fingers. Papers scattered across the floor. Mrs. Patterson helped gather them, chattering about how helpful that young man had been, how he'd found thousands in overlooked funding, how he'd just disappeared after a few months without explanation. Doris made an excuse about not feeling well, left work early, walked to the Harlem branch of the public library, asked for access to business records and public filings, spent 3 hours building a picture she both dreaded and needed to see. The Douglas Development Foundation had been established 18 years ago, shortly after Kirk's mother died. The mission statement was bland corporate language about community investment. But the actual work told a different story. Consistent, anonymous support for programs serving low-income families, education, housing assistance, job training. Nothing flashy, nothing that generated publicity, just steady, unglamorous support for things that mattered. The bookkeeping position at Bethune Publishing was real. Kirk had been on their board for years, occasionally working in their office when he wanted to be hands-on with the numbers. Albert Bethune had confirmed it, though he'd never explicitly said Kirk was wealthy. Just that he knew books and was good with his hands. The modest apartment Kirk had lived in wasn't a stage set. Public records showed he'd owned it for 12 years, maintained it as a secondary residence when he needed space from his primary life. His neighbors from that building described him as quiet, considerate, someone who'd lived there intermittently for over a decade. The thrift store clothes, the fixed pipe, the Saturday volunteering, all of it real in its way. Not performance, but the person Kirk had been trying to become before fear made him lie about the person he'd been. Doris sat in the library as it closed around her, surrounded by evidence that the man she'd loved was both more and less than she'd thought. He'd lied about his wealth, yes, but the values he'd claimed to hold, the work he'd said, mattered to him. The person he'd been becoming, all of that had roots that went back years before he'd met her. She thought about the letters in the shoebox, wondered if any of them explained this, wondered if explanation even mattered when the core fact remained. He'd had dozens of opportunities to tell her the truth and chosen deception every time. But she also wondered if the work was real, if the transformation was real, if everything except the degree of his wealth was real. What exactly had been the lie? That night, Doris finally opened the first letter. Sat at her kitchen table with coffee she didn't drink and hands that shook. The envelope was dated December, written the day after she'd told him to leave. His handwriting was cramped and desperate. Doris, I know you won't read this, but I need to write it anyway. You're right about everything. I lied. I'm Kirkland Douglas, and my company bought the postal facility where Raymond worked. I've spent 20 years building an empire that's destroyed more than it's created, and when I met you, I saw a chance to be someone better. I took it in the worst possible way, by lying to you instead of being brave enough to be honest. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it, but I need you to know that the person I was with you wasn't performance. It was the person I should have been all along, the person I'm trying to become now. Everything I told you about my father was true. Everything I told you about wanting to do work that mattered was true. The only lie was my name and my bank account. But I understand those lies invalidate everything else. I understand why you can't forgive me. I can't forgive me either. She read it twice, felt her chest constrict, set it aside and opened the second letter, dated a week later. I'm not trying to get you back. I know that's impossible. I just need you to know I'm changing things. The development project that would have destroyed the community center, I killed it. Cost me $17 million and my reputation, but it's done. You'll probably never know, and that's okay. I'm not doing it for credit. I'm doing it because it's right, and because maybe if I become the person I pretended to be, I can live with myself again. The man you met wasn't fake. He was just buried under 20 years of fear and ambition. I'm trying to dig him out. Not for you, because you're gone, but for me, because you showed me that version of myself was worth fighting for. The third letter was dated January. Shorter, more exhausted. I'm working at Bethune Publishing now, full-time, actual bookkeeper, actual salary, actual work. Albert knew who I was all along, kept my secret. Now he's giving me a chance to make the secret real. I sold the penthouse, moved back to the Harlem apartment permanently, not trying to earn anything from you, just trying to be honest about who I am, even if the only person who knows is me. I miss you. I miss the person I was with you. But I understand that person doesn't deserve missing. She read through all of them. 7 letters total, spanning from December through February. The last one was different, handwritten like the others, but never sealed, never sent, just his thoughts on paper. You asked me once if I'd be honest even when honesty was terrifying. The answer is yes, not because I've earned your trust, I destroyed that, but because you taught me that dishonesty destroys everything worth having, even when it seems protective, especially then. If we could start over knowing everything, I'd tell you the truth on day one and accept whatever came. I'd tell you I'm wealthy and damaged and trying to be better. I'd tell you my company hurt your family and I can never undo that, but I'm trying to undo the systems that made that possible. I'd tell you I love you and I don't deserve you, and I'd spend the rest of my life earning the right to the person you almost believed I was. But we don't get to start over. We just get to live with what we destroyed. I'm trying to live with it by becoming someone who destroys less and builds more. It's not enough. It's all I have." Doris sat with the letters spread across her kitchen table until dawn, cried until she had no tears left, tried to reconcile the devastation of his betrayal with the evidence that his transformation was real and costly and sustained. She didn't know if knowledge made anything better, didn't know if understanding why he'd lied made the lie more forgivable. But she knew one thing, the story she'd been telling herself, that Kirk was simply a wealthy man playing games with a poor woman for entertainment, wasn't accurate. The truth was more complicated and more painful. He'd been a man so damaged by wealth that he couldn't imagine anyone loving him without it. He'd tried to strip away everything that made him powerful to see if anything real remained underneath. He'd lied, not because he didn't value her judgment, but because he was terrified of it. None of that made the lie okay, but it made it human. As the sun rose over Harlem, Doris Day sat surrounded by 7 letters and understood she had a choice. She could hold on to her anger, righteous, justified, protective anger that kept her safe. Or she could acknowledge that people were more than their worst decisions, that transformation was possible, and that love worth having was love tested by truth and rebuilt with honesty. She didn't know which choice to make, didn't know if she was strong enough for either one. But for the first time since December, she didn't know was progress. Because not knowing meant there was still something left to discover, still something left to decide, still a possibility, however fragile, that the story wasn't over. Chapter 9. The absence that taught everything. Doris wrote the letter in early May when spring felt almost unbearably hopeful, and she could no longer carry the weight of everything unspoken. She drafted it 17 times over 2 weeks. Each version said too much or not enough, accused too harshly or forgave too easily. She finally settled on truth, even though truth was the hardest thing to write. "Kirk, I read your letters, all of them finally. I know what you did to save the community center. I know about the foundation and the years of anonymous support and the work at Bethune that was real before it was pretend. I know you destroyed your business reputation to prove something to yourself, and I understand now that you weren't playing games with me. You were trying to figure out if there was anything real left under all the armor. Here's what I need you to understand. Knowledge doesn't equal forgiveness. I can know why you lied and still be devastated that you lied. I can believe your transformation is real and still not know if I can trust you. I can understand that the person I fell in love with was buried inside you and still grieve that you didn't trust me enough to let me love all of you, even the damaged parts. I've spent 5 months learning to trust myself again, learning that being fooled doesn't make me foolish, that believing in people's better natures isn't weakness. I'm still learning, and the hardest truth is that I still love you, not the version you showed me, but the whole complicated reality of you. The man who lies out of fear and tells the truth when it costs him everything. The man who built an empire on other people's suffering and is now trying to dismantle that empire piece by piece. The man who could have simply written a check to save the community center, but instead destroyed himself to prove he'd changed. But love without trust is just beautiful pain, and I don't know if trust can be rebuilt after it's been shattered. I don't know if I'm strong enough to try. I don't know if you've learned the difference between hiding to protect yourself and being honest, even when honesty is terrifying. So I'm asking you a question, and I need you to sit with it the way I've been sitting with everything you did. If we could start over, knowing all the worst things about each other, would you be honest even when honesty might make me leave? Would you trust me enough to let me make my own choices about what I can live with? Would you understand that protecting someone from truth is just another form of control? I don't know if I'll ever be ready to see you again. I don't know if forgiveness is possible or wise. I just know I needed you to understand that I know the fuller truth now, and that I'm trying to make peace with all of it. The lie, the transformation, the love that's still there despite everything, the fear that love isn't enough. Doris. She mailed it without letting herself reconsider. Spent the next week in a state of suspended anxiety, wondering if he'd respond immediately or at all, wondering if she wanted him to respond. His reply came 10 days later, a single page, his handwriting steadier than in the desperate letters from Winter. Doris, yes, even when honesty might make you leave, especially then, because you taught me that control disguised as protection is still control, and I'm done controlling things I should be trusting. I won't promise never to be afraid of honesty. I'll promise to be honest anyway, to let you see the fear and the struggle and the work of becoming better. I won't promise to be perfect. I'll promise to be real, even when real is uncomfortable or disappointing or harder than pretending. You asked if I've learned the difference. I'm learning it. Every day. Sometimes failing, sometimes succeeding, always trying. That's the only answer I have. Not perfect transformation, but sustained effort. Not easy honesty, but committed honesty. Not the person I pretended to be, but the person I'm actually becoming, one difficult truth at a time. I love you. I don't deserve you. Those two facts can both be true. What you do with them is your choice, not mine. For the first time in my life, I'm letting someone else have that power. I'm terrified, but I trust you with it more than I trust myself. Kirk. Doris read his response standing in her hallway. Mail scattered at her feet, tears streaming down her face. He hadn't promised perfection, hadn't claimed to be fully healed, had just offered sustained effort and difficult honesty and the kind of vulnerability that came from genuine transformation. She didn't know if it was enough, but it was real, and real was a foundation they could build on if she was brave enough to try. Over the following weeks, Doris sat with the question of what she actually wanted, not what she should want or what would be safe or what would protect her from future hurt, but what she genuinely wanted when she stripped away all the fear and anger and justified protection. She wanted to see him, wanted to sit across from him and look into his eyes and see if the transformation she'd read about in letters and documents was visible in the way he carried himself. Wanted to ask him the hard questions and see if he flinched or leaned into discomfort. Wanted to discover if the connection they'd built was strong enough to survive being rebuilt on truth. But wanting wasn't the same as being ready. She needed more time to shore up her own foundations, to be certain she was choosing from strength rather than loneliness or nostalgia. She talked to her mother. Loretta listened to the whole story, then said, "Baby, nobody can tell you if this is wise. But I can tell you this. Sometimes the hardest love is the truest love. Not because difficulty makes things valuable, but because people willing to do the hard work of becoming better are people worth keeping. Just make sure he's doing the work for himself, not performing it for you. Real change doesn't need an audience." Doris talked to Eleanor, who was less charitable. "He lied to you for 6 months, changed his whole identity. That's not a small thing." "I know. And now he's done some dramatic penance and expects you to forgive him." "He's not expecting anything, that's the thing. He's doing the work whether I come back or not." Eleanor studied her. "You love him still?" "Unfortunately." "And you think you can trust him again?" "I don't know. But I think I want to try." Eleanor sighed. "Then try. But slowly, make him earn every inch of trust back. Don't let guilt or pity or loneliness make you move faster than your actual healing allows. And the first time he lies about anything, anything at all, you walk away and don't look back. Deal." By mid-June, Doris had made her decision. She'd see Kirk, talk to him, begin the slow process of discovering if what they'd almost had could survive being built on truth. She wasn't promising reconciliation or forgiveness, just the possibility of possibility. She wrote him one more letter, brief, direct. "Kirk, I need time, more time than I've taken, but I think eventually I want to see you, to talk, to ask questions and hear answers, to see if the person you're becoming is someone I can trust. I'm not promising anything except presence and honesty. If you can accept that uncertainty, if you can do the work of becoming better without needing me as reward or audience, then maybe when I'm ready we can try again, slowly, carefully, with full honesty about who we are and what we've done and what we're capable of becoming. Give me until autumn. Let me have this summer to finish healing. Then we'll see." Kirk's response came 3 days later. 3 words. "I'll be here." And somehow Doris believed him, believed that the man who'd destroyed his empire to prove he'd changed would wait however long it took. Believed that sometimes people broke themselves and in the breaking discovered who they actually were. Believed that love could survive devastation if both people were willing to rebuild with honesty instead of protection. She didn't know if they'd make it, didn't know if trust could be reconstructed once it was shattered, but she knew that not trying would haunt her more than trying and failing. Summer stretched ahead, full of heat and possibility, and the slow work of becoming whole enough to risk being broken again. Doris worked with her children, volunteered at the community center, spent evenings on her fire escape watching Harlem move and breathe and live. She was healing. Not quickly, not easily, but genuinely. And somewhere in the same neighborhood, Kirk was doing the same work. Not performing transformation for her benefit, but actually becoming someone worthy of the love he'd almost destroyed. Autumn would come. They would sit across from each other and begin the difficult work of honest conversation. What happened after that was uncertain, fragile, terrifying. But for the first time since December, uncertainty felt like hope instead of threat, and hope, however small, was enough to keep moving forward. Chapter 10. When Love Finds Its Way Home. October arrived with the particular clarity that comes when summer finally admits defeat, and Kirk Douglas found himself standing outside Bethune Publishing, terrified of walking inside. 13 months since the revelation, 8 months since he'd last heard Doris's voice, 3 months since her letter promised autumn and possibility. He'd spent those months working, changing, becoming someone he could live with. Albert had given him more responsibility at the publishing house. He'd served on community boards, actually listening instead of directing. He'd learned the difference between charity that centered his own comfort and support that centered other people's needs. He'd learned to be alone without being lonely, to find purpose beyond proving himself, to live honestly even when nobody was watching. The work wasn't finished, would never be finished, but it was real, and that reality was the only thing worth offering Doris. He walked into Bethune Publishing at precisely 5 o'clock, when the autumn light slanted gold through the windows. Doris sat at the desk he used to occupy, looking through their financial records with the same focused intensity she brought to everything. She looked up when he entered. Their eyes met, and Kirk felt time stop. She was thinner, older somehow, though only 13 months had passed. There was caution in her eyes, but also something softer, recognition without hostility, knowledge without armor. "Hi," she said quietly. "Hi." They stood in the small office, the space that had seen the beginning and near end of them, and Kirk understood that what happened in the next few minutes would determine everything. "I'm afraid," Doris said, and the honesty of it cracked something open in Kirk's chest. "Me too. I don't know if I can do this, if I can trust you, if I'm strong enough to risk being hurt again." Kirk wanted to promise she wouldn't be hurt, to offer guarantees and certainty, but promises were what got them here in the first place. "I can't promise you won't be hurt. People hurt each other even when they're trying not to, but I can promise I won't lie to you. Not about big things or small things, not when honesty is convenient or when it's terrifying. You'll know the worst of me and the best of me, and you'll get to decide what you can live with. What if the worst is too much? Then you walk away, and I accept that I destroyed something I can't rebuild. But at least you'll have made that choice with full information instead of having the choice made for you by what I decided you could handle." Doris stood up, crossed the small space between them, looked up at him with eyes that had seen too much loss and were still willing to risk more. "Tell me something true that scares you." Kirk took a breath. "I'm terrified that the person I'm becoming still isn't good enough, that the work I've done and the changes I've made don't actually fix the fundamental brokenness of who I am, that you'll see all of me and realize there's not enough there worth loving." "Tell me something else." "I wake up every morning thinking about you, wondering if you're okay, if you're happy, if you're healing. And then I feel guilty for thinking about you because you asked for space, and my thoughts aren't honoring that space. But I can't stop. You're the first thing I think about, and the last thing I think about, and most things in between. One more thing. Kirk's voice broke. I don't know if I can survive losing you again. The first time destroyed me. I rebuilt myself, but the foundation is fragile. If you try this with me and decide it doesn't work, I'll accept it because it's your right to walk away. But I need you to know that trying and failing will hurt worse than never trying. I'm choosing that hurt anyway because not trying means giving up on the possibility that real love, honest love, might be worth the risk. Doris's eyes were wet. My turn. I'm afraid that loving you means being constantly vigilant, waiting for the next lie, never fully relaxing into trust. I'm afraid that what you did will always be a wound that heals wrong, that I'll think I've forgiven you, and then something small will happen, and I'll realize the anger is still there. I'm afraid that I'll spend the rest of my life comparing everything you say to what you might be hiding. That's fair. I'm not finished. I'm also afraid that I'll use what you did as an excuse to never be fully vulnerable again, that I'll hold part of myself back and call it wisdom, when really it's just fear. That I'll punish you forever for something you've genuinely changed from, and we'll both be trapped in a relationship where I'm the martyr and you're the perpetual penitent, and neither of us gets to be fully human. Kirk nodded slowly. What do we do with all that fear? I don't know, but I think we start with the truth. All of it. Everything you've never told me. Your whole story, not the edited version you thought I could handle. They sat down. Kirk on the desk chair, Doris in the client chair across from him, and for the next 2 hours he told her everything about his father's death and the rage that fueled his success, about building an empire to prove he'd escaped poverty, only to realize he'd become exactly what killed his father, a system that used people without seeing them, about the women who'd wanted his wealth and the loneliness that came from never being seen as just himself, about meeting her and making the catastrophic decision to become someone new instead of being brave enough to be honest about who he'd been. He told her about the foundation he'd run for 18 years, trying to give back without examining why he'd needed to take so much in the first place. About the bookkeeping work at Bethune that had started as board oversight and become the most meaningful work he'd done. About the modest apartment he'd maintained for over a decade when the penthouse felt suffocating. He told her about the moment he'd seen her photo at the fundraiser and understood his company had destroyed her husband's livelihood. About the shame that had nearly made him walk away, about the cowardice that made him pursue her anyway, telling himself he could be different without being honest. He told her about the devastation of losing her, the months of barely functioning, the decision to actually become the person he'd pretended to be. About selling the penthouse and returning to Harlem permanently, about working at Bethune, not as penance, but because the work mattered, about learning to live honestly even when nobody was watching. I can't undo what my company did to Raymond, Kirk finished, his voice raw. I can't give you back what was taken. I can only promise that I'm trying to build something different, not to earn your forgiveness. I don't know if that's possible. Just to be someone who creates more than he destroys. Doris was crying silently. I need to tell you something too. I've been angry at you for 13 months. Righteous, justified anger. But I've also used that anger as armor to avoid examining my own fear. I convinced myself I was protecting myself from liars when really I was protecting myself from risk. Any risk. All risk. That's understandable. But it's not sustainable. I can't spend the rest of my life in a protective crouch. That's not living. That's just existing while calling it wisdom. She wiped her eyes. So here's my truth. I don't know if I can fully trust you. I don't know if we can build something real from this wreckage, but I know that not trying means choosing fear over hope, and I'm tired of fear winning. Kirk wanted to reach for her hands, but didn't. What are you saying? I'm saying we try, slowly, carefully, with complete honesty about where we are and what we need. No rushed forgiveness, no pretending we're healed when we're not, just small steps and hard conversations and the work of rebuilding trust piece by piece. I'll take whatever you're willing to give. I'm not willing to give much yet. I'm willing to have coffee once a week and let you prove consistency. I'm willing to ask hard questions and see if you flinch. I'm willing to tell you when I'm angry or scared or doubting, and I need you to hear that without trying to fix it. I'm willing to try, Kirk. I'm not willing to promise it'll work. Kirk felt something break open in his chest. Not hope exactly, but the possibility of hope. That's more than I deserve. Maybe, but that's what I'm offering. Not because you've earned it, but because I'm choosing to believe people can change. That transformation is possible. That love can survive devastation if both people are willing to do the hard work. They sat in the quiet of the office while the autumn light faded to dusk. Finally, Doris stood. "Walk me home." They walked through Harlem streets as October evening settled cool and clear. Didn't hold hands, didn't make promises about forever, just walked side by side, two people who'd broken each other, learning whether the broken pieces could be reassembled into something whole. At her door, Doris turned to face him. "Same time next week?" "I'll be here." "I know you will. That's the remarkable thing." She paused, hand on the doorknob. "Thank you for telling me everything. For not editing yourself to be more palatable. That took courage. You deserve the truth. Should have had it from the beginning." "Yes, but you're giving it now. That matters too." After she went inside, Kirk stood on the street and let himself feel the fragile possibility of beginning again. It wouldn't be easy. Would require years of rebuilding trust through consistent honesty. Would mean living with uncertainty and accepting that she might ultimately decide forgiveness wasn't possible. But standing there in the October evening, Kirk understood that this uncertain possibility was more real than anything he'd had before, because it was built on truth instead of performance, because Doris knew the worst of him and was choosing to see if there was enough good mixed in to be worth the risk. 3 years later, Kirk held their daughter while Doris finished her coffee, morning light streaming through the windows of the small apartment they'd chosen together in the heart of Harlem. Their daughter, Amara, eternal in Arabic, a name they'd chosen because some loves survived everything, reached for her father's face with the unself-conscious trust of someone who'd never known anything but honesty. Doris watched them, her heart so full, it ached. The years hadn't been easy. There had been fights when old wounds reopened, moments when she'd doubted everything, nights when she'd wondered if trust was possible or just something she was performing. But Kirk had shown up every single time, had been honest even when honesty cost him, had let her be angry without trying to manage her anger, had done the work of becoming better, not as performance, but as genuine transformation. "What are you thinking about?" Kirk asked, bouncing Amara gently. "That I'm still scared sometimes. That trust is a daily choice, not a permanent state. That I'm grateful you've made that choice worth making." She set down her coffee, crossed to them. "That real love isn't about people who never break. It's about people who break and then choose the hard work of healing honestly instead of hiding the broken pieces." Kirk shifted Amara to one arm, reached for Doris with the other. "I love you, the real you. Not a version I wished existed, and I love that you love the real me, even the parts I'm still working on." Outside, Harlem was waking, voices calling, music drifting from windows, life moving forward with all its beautiful, complicated humanity. Inside, two people who'd destroyed and rebuilt each other held their daughter and understood that the greatest love stories weren't about perfection. They were about people brave enough to be honest, vulnerable enough to be seen, and committed enough to do the work of becoming worthy of each other's truth.